Hello and welcome to WITA. It is a glorious fall day in Washington, D.C., and I hope it's lovely wherever you are tuning in from. We have a fabulous and timely discussion today, but before we get to today's panel, a few notes on upcoming WITA events. Next Friday, November 4th, we have another timely event to discuss new U.S. export controls on semiconductors sold to China. Those new rules have shaken up global supply chains and have major implications for U.S.-China relations. We hope you'll join us. Then on Thursday, November 9th, we'll be following up on today's discussion with a broader discussion of green industrial policies and trade. Information on both those events can be found in the event program we sent around this morning and on our website, www.wita.org. As you know, if you've watched any of our past webinars, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. Excuse me. Welcome today to Sergio Gomez Lora, CEO of the Business Council of Mexico and the United States. Excuse me. Colin Bird, the Consul General of Canada, the United States. Dawn Shackelford, Executive Director for Trade Agreements Policy at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And Chair Lee, Chief Representative for POSCO America. Welcome Sergio, Colin, Dawn, and Chair, and welcome to all of you. Welcome and special thanks as well to Silverado Policy Accelerator, who sponsor WITA's Trade and Environment series. Thank you for your support. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom. You should have also received a copy of today's event program with panelist biographies by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. If you spent any time talking to trade people in the United States in the past 3 months, you know that today's topic is front of mind, not only for US policy shapers, but for trade officials around the world who are part of the automobile supply chain. We have a great panel today who we hope can give us all a better understanding of what these new provisions mean for America's trading relationships and whether these new provisions will help America achieve its near-term and long-term climate objectives. Welcome today to Jennifer Safavian, President and CEO of Autos Drive America, who represents international automakers in the United States. Ben Beachy, the Vice President of Manufacturing and Industrial Policy at the BlueGreen Alliance, which brings together labor unions and environmental organizations. David Henig, Director of the UK Trade Policy Project at the European Center for International Political Economy, one of Europe's leading think tanks. And our moderator, John Magnus, President of TradeWinds. John and I have known each other a long time. I think, John, we first met when we were both working on legislation to implement the Uruguay round in the 1990s. And here we are talking about GATT Article 3 once again. It's always a pleasure to see you, John. Take it away.
Thanks very much. Good morning. Thanks to Ken and to WITA for inviting me to moderate today's webinar. We're already well launched by Ken. I'm just going to add a couple of scene-setting observations and get quickly out of the way of our excellent panelists. This year's Inflation Reduction Act, which you might hear referred to during this event as IRA, has lots of different kinds of carbon control provisions. Many of those deal with the broader energy sector, but the one relevant today involves the transportation sector. And in particular, the government promoted transition to electric vehicles. Like most of the IRA's carbon control provisions, this one relies on incentives rather than direct regulation. And like other IRA incentives, the one for electric vehicles, which is a $7,500 consumption subsidy, has some strings attached. The strings relevant for today involve vehicle assembly in North America and the provenance of certain battery components. For those of you who are familiar with apparel trade, and on the assumption that Steve Lamar might be listening somewhere, these provisions are reminiscent of the yarn forward rule. If you want the favorable treatment, you have to produce in such and such a way using specified inputs. It's pretty prescriptive. And ultimately, producers have to decide whether organizing their processes and supply chains to get the favorable treatment is or isn't worthwhile. Anyway, the legislation sets out a category of electric vehicles eligible for the favorable treatment, and that category prominently does not include imported electric vehicles, except the ones imported from Canada and Mexico. That alone makes the provision, whatever its others merits or demerits, a source of potential trade friction. The broader category in which this measure falls, which is the category of green measures with trade implications, has historically not always been easy to manage. Enter WITA. I love how WITA sculpts its talk events and brings you people who can go up 100 feet, step back, provide something that goes beyond just reciting talking points, but more observations that are contextualized. And today is no exception. We're very fortunate to have this group assembled. There's naturally some interest in how the government to government aspects of this are likely to play out. Our panelists might be willing to take a stab at that. One thing that's clear is that the EV provision has already attracted some expressions of concern from trading partners like the EU, Korea, Japan, and added to that this week, China and Russia added their criticisms in Geneva. The Biden administration, for its part, has struck a confident pose and therefore may have thought of some interesting moves it can make, either to head off a dispute or to deal with the consequences of one if it occurs. Now that's it. If you're not on the edge of your seat, you should be. Let's get to our speakers. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, John. Good morning, John and David and Ben, and thank you to Ken for the invitation to participate in this webinar today. And I agree, this is a very timely issue. I thought I would start off with my opening comments and just provide, I think, some context to, I think, electrification in the U.S. and this consumer credit in particular. And really demand for EVs has increased significantly over the past 2 years due to increasing model choices for consumers to choose the vehicle that best fits their needs, improvements in technology, and more recently, of course, the increase in gas prices. Since 2019, the EV market share in the US for new vehicle sales has risen more than threefold. So it was 1.9% in 2019, and it's now 6.3% in the third quarter of this year. However, EV adoption in the US still lags far behind many other developed economies. So far this year, EVs have accounted for nearly 20% of new vehicle sales in the EU and 26% of sales in China. This makes an incentive for consumers that much more important to help persuade them to adopt clean vehicles. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, the previous EV credit of $7,500 was available to all clean vehicles, regardless of where they were manufactured. The only limitation was the per manufacturer cap of 200,000 vehicles. And prior to the IRA being signed into law on August 16th, there were 60 different EV models available to consumers that were eligible to receive the EV credit. The very next day, only 18 of those vehicles remained eligible to receive the $7,500 credit. That's a 70% reduction in consumer choice. And because as soon as the law was signed into law, final assembly had to occur in North America, which automatically excluded numerous imports of vehicles from South Korea, Japan, and the EU. And once Treasury issues guidance, which is expected at the end of the year, there will be additional eligibility requirements, which increase restrictions on critical minerals and battery component content. And those go into effect starting next year. The auto industry is not opposed to the overall goal of the IRA, which is to accelerate U.S. investment in environmental policy. And there are certainly incentives in the law to help on that front. But let's keep in mind that automakers' investments in the U.S. into clean technology were happening even before the passage of the IRA. International automakers in particular had made significant announcements that they were going to increase investments in the U.S. to produce batteries and EVs here. This is a very capital intensive industry, and it takes months, even years, to plan where these investments go. The concern I have with this law is that it does not take into account the current challenges that automakers are facing with supply chain shortages, nor the time needed to adjust supply chains and build out production in North America. And the results could very well be a slowdown in EV adoption at a time when there is billions in investments and increased consumer interest. And there's no question that the complexity of the law could result in confusion and frustration among consumers looking to purchase a clean vehicle. Keep in mind that even the previous EV credit proposal that was considered during the Build Back Better debate provided 5 years for the auto industry to adjust and build out domestic supply chains. There is no one who believes that this will happen overnight, but that is exactly what the IRA demands. North America is not equipped or prepared to provide the critical minerals and battery components needed to produce the demand for EVs. It could take 5 years for North America to meet the demands of today's market, not taking into account the expected demand for EVs in 5 years. The supply chains will struggle to catch up to demand for the foreseeable future. So it would be to our advantage if we could turn to our closest allies to help us now with critical minerals and battery component demands as we build up our North America supplies. But the IRA restricts access to those sources for a vehicle to receive the credit. The reality is China controls the vast majority of the critical mineral extraction and processing around the globe, and restricting access to sources from reliable allies will only make it more costly to source from the countries that are currently eligible. The EU, South Korea, and Japan continue to raise strong concerns and objections with the administration and Congress over their view that this law is discriminatory because vehicles made in those countries are not eligible to receive the credit, nor are vehicles assembled in North America that receive critical minerals or battery components from these countries. The law has the potential to harm relations with important allies as the US works to build coalitions and partnerships on climate, supply chain diversification, and in other areas like the WTO, IPEF, and the EU TTC. It may incentivize copycat policies around the world that will harm US exports if enacted. Bringing more investment to the US, diversifying supply chains, and working to fight climate change is something that I think we can all support, but it could have been done in a way that doesn't discriminate against our closest allies and that allowed the US to continue leading the rules-based trading system. We all have a global commitment to reduce climate change, and working together will get us further than turning inward on industrial policy. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, John. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you very much. Next up is Ben Beachy. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and thanks to WITA for the invite. I'm glad to be with you all today. So, as mentioned, I work at the BlueGreen Alliance, and for those of you not familiar, the BlueGreen Alliance is a coalition that unites 14 unions and environmental groups to help secure win-win policy solutions for climate action, good jobs, and a more equitable economy. We worked alongside many allies to help get a number of the climate investments in the Inflation Reduction Act and to help get the bill across the finish line. The EV tax credit issue, I think, spotlights two key goals that our union and environmental partners share: deployment and manufacturing. I think those are the twin goals that we're discussing today: rapid deployment of EVs and other technology that we need to meet our climate goals, and building reliable and equitable domestic supply chains for that technology. Now, the rumblings from the EU, Korea, Japan, and now China and Russia about the EV tax credit have emphasized tensions between these two goals, deployment and manufacturing. But I actually think there's more congruence between these two goals than initially meets the eye. And I'll briefly name 4 ways that I see these two goals as congruent. Happy to elaborate on these ways as we get into the discussion. First, the EV manufacturing incentives offer a big opportunity to marry climate action with high-paying manufacturing jobs, allowing more workers to reap the economic gains of climate action. And that's how we expand the chorus of support for bolder and bolder climate policies. We will win more climate policies that enable more EV deployment when more workers see such policies as essential, not only for future generations, but for their own paycheck next month. A second way that onshoring EV manufacturing supports our climate goals is that it helps to reduce our dependence on imports of EV materials like steel and aluminum that tend to be more emissions intensive when produced overseas. Third, onshoring EV manufacturing is important to reduce the vulnerability that is currently baked into our supply chains, which of course exposes our climate goals to everything from shipping bottlenecks to geopolitical specs. And finally, such onshoring will also help to spur increased global competition that we need to lower EV prices over the medium term. instead of simply accepting the status quo of intense market concentration. As Jennifer mentioned, right now, China makes 3 out of every 4 EV batteries in the world. So we should not pin our EV deployment goals on trust that the world's monopoly producers will maintain low prices. So I see more congruence than divergence between our EV manufacturing and deployment goals over the medium term. Now, I understand, of course, the concern that the domestic manufacturing requirements could inhibit deployment in the short term. The IRA itself and other policies can help to mitigate that risk, though. The deployment concern, as Jennifer laid out, is essentially, that the EV tax credit creates a demand pool for US-made batteries that will be met with an inadequate supply of US battery manufacturing. But the IRA and bill, both the bipartisan infrastructure law, they both include billions of dollars in supply-side investments for EV battery manufacturing that can help to ease this constraint. Just last week, President Biden announced about $2.8 billion in grants from the bipartisan infrastructure law for about 20 companies to produce battery components and minerals across the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act itself also offers a lot of supply-side support for domestic battery and EV manufacturing. For example, the 45X tax credit is estimated to be worth at least $30 billion specifically for manufacturing EV batteries and processing critical minerals, among other things. In addition, there's the $10 billion 48C manufacturing tax credit, $3 billion for the Department of Energy to extend EV manufacturing loans, $2 billion for grants to convert closed auto plants into new EV factories, etc. This supply push complements the demand pool of the EV tax credit as part of a holistic approach to meeting our twin goals of deployment and manufacturing. And it's because of this direct support for EV manufacturing and battery manufacturing that a host of companies, both foreign and domestic, have announced plans in just the last couple months since the IRA passed to invest about $11 billion to establish EV battery manufacturing facilities here in the United States. Panasonic, LG, Honda, Toyota, Stellantis. These are a few of the companies based in Japan, Korea, and the EU that have recently announced plans to establish new battery manufacturing facilities in the United States, in part to take advantage of the IRA's supply-side subsidies for battery manufacturing. And those same facilities owned by Japanese, Korean, and European firms will further benefit from the EV tax credit when it boosts demand for the batteries that they produce in those facilities. And that brings me back to the brewing threat from Japan, Korea, and the EU and others of this potential WTO case against the EV tax credit. First, I do think it's a bit ironic that Japan, Korea, and the EU are contemplating a trade case against the US policy that stands to benefit manufacturers based in Japan, Korea, and the EU. But more broadly, I simply do not think that we should be using decades-old trade rules to attack each other's climate policies. Other countries beyond the United States are also pursuing standard industrial policy approaches as a path to meeting climate goals, and that's their prerogative. Each country should have the policy space to pursue climate action in ways that gets the job done. And instead of launching more tit-for-tat trade threats against climate policies, I think the US and its trading partners should take a more proactive, collaborative approach, such as by crafting a mechanism like a climate peace clause. With such a clause, WTO members could agree to a moratorium on using WTO rules to challenge each other's climate policies. That could offer the policy space that we need for climate action in the critical next few years. It also could foster increased cross-border discussion and climate collaboration instead of more brinksmanship. I think that's important because we have less than a decade to turn the corner on climate change. Deployment and manufacturing are both essential for meeting our shared climate targets, and many countries are currently enacting policies to achieve both goals. And as these policies advance, we simply do not have time for hurdles based on trade rules written before we even knew about climate change. So I hope the trade regime catches up to our unyielding climate reality. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Ben. As noted earlier, this thing has attracted attention in a number of foreign capitals. We can't bring you every one of those perspectives in a webinar like this, but we do have a European perspective up next. David?
Thank you for this invite. Yes, I think my role is to kind of put the view forward from other countries. I was in Brussels last week talking to folk about this. I've spoken to trade folk from other countries as well, and yeah, they're noticing the electric vehicle parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I don't go back as long as Ken and John in trade, not quite. But I've rarely come across such outburst of real kind of hostility and concern from other countries. They really dislike this intently, and there's a real problem. And I think we've got to start at that point. There is a real problem with this, and it's not working. Cards on the table from my point of view. I'm a big believer that trade is part of the answer to resolving climate change, and the protectionism is going to be a barrier to that. The protection is just going to give companies the chance to basically demand constant subsidies and protection in order to bring in climate change measures, whereas trade will actually serve to bring the technologies, the best practice technologies and lower costs to consumers. Now we accept the workers' point as well, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Look, I'm no fan also of what other countries are doing. The EU is doing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What's the biggest problem with that? It's a unilateral measure that has not really been discussed with trade partners. Inflation Reduction Act, a unilateral measure not really discussed with trading partners. So the question is, for me, the first part of this is, do we need unilateral action on trade and climate change in order to make this happen, or is there some alternative? And it follows on to me to think, okay, why are we taking these unilateral actions? Is it because of climate change, or are we trying to protect domestic industry? And I'm afraid to say, in both the EU and the US, it's pretty clear that we both are trying to protect domestic industry as much as, if not more, than we're trying to address climate change. That's just blunt, but that is where I feel that we are. Now, why are we doing that? Because I think that's pretty important to get the cards on the table. Are we doing it because we think that China is in the lead on this, is cheating, and we need to be protected from China? In which case, EU, US, everybody else who has concerns about that, we can work together on that. Or are we doing it because we're saying the car industry is so crucial to domestic acceptability of any government that at all costs we must maintain production of a car industry in our countries? I think it might be that. I'm a free trader, but I'm a realist as well. If we're basically saying we have to have a car industry, and we're afraid we won't, okay, what can we then do about that? So that leaves me on to the question, so why are we not working with others? There's this concept of an idea, friendshoring. If we're concerned about China, why are we not then seeing the US and the EU? Finally, we are. There's going to be a meeting between the EU and the US. But where are the discussions with South Korea, with Japan, with the UK, with others? Because, I don't think, Ben, I think the idea that we create some policy space for climate change is not the worst in the world. The idea of not taking disputes. I've written something similar myself, that we should be looking at creating some space, but only if we're doing that in a way that is genuinely collaborative. It can't be the case of each country saying this is the space I need and carving out so much space. It is hugely harming and distorting the overall market. Even then, very much a second best solution to WTO action. But if it has to be this way, then at least do it with partners. And what is that saying about the WTO? Are we now abandoning the idea that we can do any kind of business with China? Are we abandoning the idea that our domestic manufacturing cannot compete with China? I don't believe that's the case in the car sector. in a different world, I believe that the Chinese manufacturers who have made great technological progress in electric vehicles, they would be trying to set up production facilities in the US and in the EU. Now we're saying that the politics doesn't allow for that. Okay, what are we saying about the future of the WTO? I don't think I like it. I don't think that's creating a better place if we're saying China's out now. We have to do this on our own. So, for me, some pretty big questions. Where do we start with this? Well, we are where we are. Where do we start? We need to get those conversations going. We need to be saying, all right, maybe we are going to have to carve out some policy space. I don't actually disagree with the premise that having a healthy car industry is something our citizens need to see in order to buy in a little bit into the transition to electric vehicles. But we're going to need huge investments anyway in the car sector for the transition to electric. There will be ways to get people bought into this. I think the key for me is we need to see the dialogue, because otherwise the direction of the Inflation Reduction Act and CBAM is a direction going towards a kind of free-for-all in rules of unilateral action, and that is not, to me, going to help solve the climate change issues, and it's going to be no good for trade either. So I think that's where I come in. I'm coming in with the warning of saying, okay, this has been passed by Congress, but it's time to take a step back and have some proper dialogue around this issue. Back to you, John.
Thanks very much, David. Well, I suspect that our panelists might benefit from a lightning round here if they would like to react to what they've heard from each other. In the absence of that, I guess I have a question I would toss out in the first instance to David and Jennifer, and then for Ben to react. Ben has laid out a case that says that the nationality-based restrictions are a feature, not a bug, and that you need those as well as the direct production incentives in order for this thing to work. And I guess I'd like to know whether you agree, and then hear Ben's reaction to that. So the nationality-based restrictions, meaning the rule that says you can't get the consumption subsidy without assembly occurring in the United States and without the battery materials originating in the right place. And we have to have that as well as all of the forms of direct support for domestic manufacturing. The direct support I would call painting inside the lines, and the nationality-based restrictions is painting outside the lines. And is that part of it necessary for this thing to work or not? David and Jennifer.
Well, I mean, I was just speaking on this. I don't buy that that's required. I'm sorry. I believe, if you're believing in trade and believing in the core principles of trade that we're all going to benefit from trade, the idea that without obstructing your market, essentially what you're saying is the car industry is just going to go from the US. Well, if that's the case, then there are pretty bigger issues to be talking about. But I don't believe that's the case. I believe that car makers will still want to make cars in the US to sell into the US, and that you don't need to be putting in so many restrictions. If you're worried about cheating, let's talk about cheating. If you're worried about other things, we can have that conversation. But I cannot believe that the answer is you have to protect.
So I'll jump in and say, listen, I agree with what David is saying there. And I would add to it that, for auto manufacturers, these are global companies. They are looking to produce, especially my members here, the international automakers in the US, are looking to produce vehicles for the US market, but also to export to other countries. I mean, that is a key critical piece of this. And so if we put policies like this that look inward and are very protectionist, other countries are going to follow suit. And therefore, the American-made vehicles that we make here in this country are not going to be able to be sold in these other countries. Just like what you're hearing from Japan, EU, and South Korea, the complaints they're making right now, we're going to have the same issues. And so that's only going to hurt American workers here. together if we're not able to sell and export more of these American-made vehicles. I think I think this can be done, as David has said, more broadly and more looking at this together. It's a global issue that we all can be working towards. Yes, if we're all looking to find a way to kind of offset China's dominance, the best way to do that is for us to do it together and not look for protectionist, inward-looking policies, which is exactly what the Inflation Reduction Act and the Clean Vehicle Credit in particular, with the restrictions, are actually doing.
Ben, I imagine you'd care to react to that, and maybe in doing so, you could answer this as well. Is there any amount of direct support, in your view, that would remove the need for the nationality-based restrictions piece of this, or do they always have to work hand in hand?
So let me respond first. To elaborate, I think we're discussing a political economy question, right? Of how do we, at the end of the day, secure climate action? Let me just say, I view trade as a means to an end, not the end itself, right? The ends that we're pursuing here, I think we probably broadly agree, are a livable climate, good jobs that create economic security, broadly shared prosperity and equity. And so we should structure in as much our trade policies as our domestic measures so as to achieve those ends. And one way that I suggested that I think we achieve those ends of climate action in the United States is by building the chorus of support for stronger climate policies. And that starts with really marrying climate action with good manufacturing jobs. And of course, manufacturing jobs tend to offer above average wages, benefits, and union access. There was a study this year that we commissioned from UMass Amherst that found the Inflation Reduction Act is likely to create about 400,000 jobs over the next decade from all the clean transportation investments in IRA, and about 100,000 of those were from the new clean vehicle tax credit. And given the design of the tax credit, of course, many of those are intended to be in manufacturing. And I said at the outset that I think this is critical, not only to strengthen economic security, but to really expand the chorus of workers and families that are calling for bold climate action. It's an example, I think, of the congruence between manufacturing and deployment. EV manufacturing incentives can mean a bigger push for new policies that will support more EV deployment. And that, thankfully, is not a theory at this point. That is the empirical reality if you look across countries. There's a study released this summer in Energy Policy Journal that did a panel study across countries and found that this virtuous cycle of marrying deployment with manufacturing yields more push for more deployment. They found that that's actually the norm across the countries. More local manufacturing yields more ambitious deployment policies. So I don't think we should ignore that empirical reality in designing our policies. I do think that is how we win. That's how we get the job done. The other things that I would just name, I do think we have to really take into account the embodied emissions that go into these goods. This is usually not a reported part of this conversation, but just as an example, the average EV battery has about 77 pounds of aluminum in it. Over half of the world's aluminum is smelted in China, and making the average ton of aluminum in China causes 60% more climate pollution than in the United States. So, as we produce more aluminum for electric vehicles to achieve our climate goals, we cannot afford to depend on highly polluting aluminum production overseas that moves us in exactly the opposite direction. So again, I think the onshoring actually serves the purpose of climate action. Lastly, I would just say, again, with regard to supply chains, the supply chain vulnerability is real, right? The pandemic taught us that. Import dependency is just as risky for electric vehicles as it was for N95 masks. Again, right now, China makes 3 out of every 4 of the world's EV batteries. And, to ensure consistent deployment, we need to make more clean energies nuts and bolts here. that is critical so that we don't expose our climate goals to geopolitics, to shipping bottlenecks and everything else that we've seen in the last couple of years. So I don't think that these considerations are outside of the question of how do we achieve strong climate action, the EV deployment goals that we all seek. In fact, I think they are critical inputs to that question. And I think they yield the answer that it's critical to marry our deployment incentives with strong manufacturing incentives.
Thank you, Ben. There's a question in the Q&A that has to do with what scope does exist for the roughest edges of this thing to be sanded down in the implementation process without a new act of Congress. I wonder, from the point of view of those who would like to see this operating a little bit differently, do you see a pathway to getting those felt needs met without a new act of Congress?
So I mean, I would say clearly, obviously, if Congress were to clarify or make some corrections to this law, that would be the cleanest way for this to be done. But I think we all recognize the difficulty in that. Listen, we'll see what happens with the election. We'll see what might possibly be possible in a lame duck session. But I think most people probably assume that that's quite a hill for us to climb to get Congress to make any fixes or changes to this law. But I know for certain that our closest allies, being South Korea, Japan, and the EU, have been speaking regularly with members of Congress, with the administration at all levels of the administration, right? I mean, we knew from a while ago, South Korea has like weekly conversations about this issue. And just the other day, it was announced that, the EU now has, and the US have now created a task force to talk about this issue. And we've got the TTC coming up next month in early December, where I think, this could take over that conversation as well. This is something that they continue to talk with the administration about, trying to find a solution. We know that Treasury is working on guidance right now. There's a lot of things, a lot of questions, a lot of areas where they can expand and they can provide definitions when it comes to the Clean Vehicle Act. But it's unclear how far they can go or will be able to go. Secretary Yellen the other day pretty much said, the law is what it is. And so, I think a lot of people felt like, that was her way of saying there's not much that we can do on this front. And I don't know how much they can do on this front. I know people are asking for them to take into consideration, certainly, what this is doing with our trading relationships with some of our closest allies, and hoping that they take that in consideration. And if there are ways for them to broaden and provide more flexibility in that regard, hopefully the administration is taking a closer look at some of those possible ways of doing that.
Thank you for that. I guess there's one other question in the Q&A that I may be preempting Ken by doing this, but I just it's so well formulated that I just want to read it directly rather than paraphrase it. We've spent this is a question about that goes up a little ways and sort of tries to situate this in the broader context of sort of trade policy and policy space and where we've been historically. So here's the question. We've spent 40 years forcing our close allies and trading partners to abandon domestic content tax measures identical to this. Are we now telling them that they're free to do this to us, not just in autos or to fight climate change, but in any sector where they see a strong national interest, food security, technology leadership, public health, et cetera? So that takes us up and out of autos a little bit and to a higher plane, but I'll invite responses from any of the panelists who care to take that one on.
Well, I think the answer is yes. I mean, we're already seeing that. We're already hearing that. from some of our closest allies. They're already talking about it. And yes, right now they are speaking about in the context of EVs, right, in the auto sector, because that's what's most pressing. That's what's impacting everything right now. With the final assembly requirement for electric vehicles happened as soon as the president signed the law. So that's what everybody's focused on right now and the impact that that is having. So you are hearing France and Germany just recently talking about, why don't we do something similar to this, where only European made vehicles can receive, credits for EVs. And I think that's only going to continue. I think that's the fear, right? That is certainly the worry, that if we do things like this, whether it's in this context or in other contexts, other countries are going to follow suit. And then, the whole structure of trade, I think kind of starts to fall apart.
Any other takes on that one?
Yeah, I would say my response would go back to, I think that points back to the need for something like a peace clause, right, on climate policies. Within the realm of climate action, I just, it is too important what we do across borders in the next 5 to 10 years to be challenging each other's policies at the WTO using rules written, in some cases in the 40s and 50s. To the point that David made, the point that we should be striving for cross-border approaches, more multilateral or at least plurilateral approaches, and not relying on turning on unilateralism. I think actually that's part of the impetus for suggesting something like a peace clause. I think we only start to collaborate when we cool down the temperatures that we currently see among trading partners. And that starts by saying we're agreeing not to attack each other's policies. The US is not unique in pursuing an industrial policy approach to climate goals. We're actually behind the curve in doing so, right? Like most countries have been pursuing industrial policy approaches to a whole range of goals, including climate action. And I think we need to take a pause on using old trade rules to attack those policies and instead declare a moratorium or a peace clause, so as to create the space, open up the space for further cross-border discussion and collaboration on how we work together to solve the collective action problem that is climate change.
And I'll come in as well there. Look, I mean, the old ways of doing it are not going to work anywhere in the WTO because there is no fully functioning dispute settlement system at the WTO. Yeah, so we're not in that space. Look, I do think that we need to be having those discussions about where trade and climate change needs to go. But I think you've got to accept that if you're going to put forward something like this Inflation Reduction Act with these measures, then your trade partners are going to take their own actions, and it gives the US less power to do anything about that. Now, what we almost need to get to is to say, right, this far and no further. We need to find, as trade professionals, as industry folk, as various other stakeholders, we need to find the place where we can end this unilateral action and start the process. So not having immediate disputes, that's okay for the moment. But what's the point at which we say, look, actually, you know what, a UK-made vehicle going to the US is fine, actually, and a US-made vehicle going to the UK or wherever it is. So I think we need, if we can use this as the impetus to then find a new way to look at trade and climate change rules, fine. But that has to involve trade. That cannot just be a kind of threats of a unilateral approach. I recognise why we got to where we are, and that it's pretty difficult to unwind from this. That's got dangers, and I'm sort of sounding the alarm that if we go any further, you're beginning to struggle to see how the WTO and the trade system even survives that, and that is going to cost us jobs and measures against climate change, and I don't think anybody wants that.
Thank you, David. There are also a couple of questions in the queue, but Ken, good. You want to?
No, please. If you had your eye on one or two, go ahead. I was going to jump in, but please go ahead.
Well, there are a couple of questions in the queue about this idea that the imports might that measures like this discourage might have a high amount of embedded carbon. a couple of questions about that, and so we've heard one of those is a question for Ben, and then we haven't heard from our other panelists about that either. One that came in from Jennifer Hillman is, why not then just directly act against dirty imports without any reference to nationality? If any of
John, frozen for you.
You better go for it, Ben. You'll have to take over.
Okay. John, I'm assuming you were inviting us to respond to that. Happy to. Great question. In short, I do support directly targeting that precise problem of the degree of embodied emissions in our trade flows. I support and have voiced some pretty detailed opinions on CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and how that could be crafted in tandem with our trade partners, so as to stem the trend of the last couple of decades of the outsourcing of our most polluting facilities to countries with lower environmental and labor standards and more emissions intensive manufacturing. The net result of that has been not only lost jobs, but an increase in climate pollution. I use the example of aluminum. We used to, in the early 90s, we had 23 aluminum smelters in this country. Today we have 5 that are still operating. And as the U.S. aluminum manufacturing industry declined, China grew to become the #1 aluminum producer in the world by far. They now produce, again, over half of the aluminum in the world. And this is critical for our clean technologies, our transition to a clean energy economy, because aluminum is a critical input, not only for electric vehicles and EV batteries, but for solar panels, for power lines, for a whole host of technologies. And today, China, to produce the average ton of aluminum in China, as I mentioned, causes more than 50% more emissions, more than 60% more emissions than the average ton of aluminum in the United States. And so I do support policies that would directly address that problem. And I don't think that has to be just the United States. I think that could be a transatlantic approach to this that would set up a tax on highly climate polluting imports based precisely on the degree of embodied emissions in those imports, so as to not only stem the outsourcing of polluting facilities to countries with lower standards, but to spur and reshoring of those facilities back to countries that have taken bold action to reduce emissions in the manufacturing sector. That would be a win-win for our climate goals and for jobs.
I just want to come back on a few bits of this, and just, all of us do this, not just Ben, but we have these big figures about how much China is producing in terms of electric vehicles or aluminium. China is also a huge major market for this. I remember one of the most senior folk in one of the US car makers saying to me a few years ago, just when we were discussing TTIP between the EU and the US, China is soon about to have greater demand for vehicles than the US and the EU put together. And I think we've passed that point, actually. So it's not surprising that China is now this great producer. And I don't think we've got round to answering that question as to whether we now want nothing more to do with China or whether we're actually prepared to have them in the system. That's the first part. The second part is, and we face this in Europe as well, jobs. We keep talking about bringing back these manufacturing jobs. There are going to be fewer manufacturing jobs in electric vehicles than there are going to be in traditional gas vehicles, petrol vehicles, because the supply chains are shorter. There's far fewer parts, so we're going to face that problem anyway, even if we make so many vehicles. So I think we've got to address those issues as well. Obviously, Europe is doing a carbon border adjustment, although it's not going to cover autos initially. it's going to be pretty complex. We're going to have to see how it works. The EU is not going to go back on that. So we're going to have carbon pricing. There are discussions in various places, the OECD, WTO, as to what we're going to, as to how that might get expanded. And I think that is going to be part of the answer. But I just kind of, the warning signs are here for me that, yeah, these things can be part of the answer. But this is a big issue, and we just need to keep a track of all the assumptions we're making, and I keep coming back to and kind of protect the trade. We don't want trade is not the end in itself, but trade is part of the answer to climate change.
I'll just jump in real quick and say that I thought it was an interesting question, but I would say, I think as we all know, the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't allow for so-called, quote, cleaner vehicles. There's no exception for that in the law. And I think, some of the other points to raise is I think, the US and the EU are working right now on a clean steel initiative. And I think actions like this, policies like this, are not going to help those discussions come along. And I do want to mention, we talk a lot about, of course, China and the dominance in China and of course, having to import things from China. But what this law neglects to do is, of course, turn to our closest allies, where we have like-minded opinions and policies to better the environment. And this policy, this law actually prevents us from working with those countries to get these critical minerals, to get these batteries from these countries and allow them to build out their networks instead of China having dominance in the critical mineral and battery component space. We should be encouraging these other countries to be helping us in building out more of these mines and these processing, these refineries. And this law actually does just the opposite.
So, okay, there's so much that's been addressed here today. John and I were in the chat going with each other. It's almost hard to get my arms around the different questions that have come in. So I'm going to do my best to try to group a few of them together. But there's a theme that runs throughout is, what vehicles. I think, Jennifer, you mentioned a figure that there were like 17 vehicles it was some number like that from several dozen or maybe even 100. I can't remember what it was before, that qualify right now for the new credits sort of instantly upon signature. What are things that could be done absent legislation? I think there's a belief growing that there might be some divided government coming in the United States. So the likelihood of legislative action on climate issues in the next 2 years seems rather small. Although there often are technical fixes done to legislation, technical corrections acts, and those sorts of things that actually do get done even in divided government when there are things that aren't working. There were some points raised in the Q&A about regulatory actions that might be able to be taken, that there are waivers that the Federal Highway Administration is creating for Buy America provisions on EV charging stations until there's more domestic components available. So what are some steps, both I can direct this to, I think, Ben and Jennifer, this is more of a domestic question, David, that can be taken over the next few months or the next year or two within the US, both regulatory and legislatively, that could make these provisions work better than maybe they would if they were done in some different ways? I'm sorry, I'm asking it in a very broad way. And Ben may think it all does work, although I don't think we can know that quite yet because it's so new. But what are some fixes? Even when it was done, Ben, if your alliance was happy with how it was done, that they saw and said, "Oh, it could be done better. Here's a couple ways we would have probably suggested they fix it or improve it." I don't know, Ben, Jennifer, who else? Ben,
I'll take a first stab, sure. So look, no law is perfect, right? Show me the perfect law. So I am certainly not discounting the opportunity to shoot for rules that prioritize the dual goals that I named of both spurring increased deployment and manufacturing. And the devil's often in the details of these things, right? The statute itself is a few pages of text for billions of dollars going out the door, and so a lot of rules will have to be defined. So yes, that will be critical for shaping future direction. But I actually would point more to the supply side measures that I mentioned that are also in the bill, because the rules are also not yet written for those. That 45X tax credit that I mentioned, the Joint Committee on Taxation thought it was worth $30 billion. Credit Suisse thinks it's worth maybe even double that, right? That's no small, that's not chump change. That's a huge bucket of money specifically designed for battery manufacturers in the United States to lower their capital costs and operating expenses. And so you have just a very large untapped funding source and that's completely new. We did not have that tax credit before, right? So I expect that as companies, both foreign and domestic, take advantage of such supply side investments in EV battery manufacturing in the United States, that we'll see that list of EV companies and EV brands that qualify for the EV tax credit to go up. I certainly hope that they take advantage of it. That's why it's there. So I just would, urge all of us to not ignore the supply side of the equation because it's enormous, and there's a great opportunity there to invest in both deployment and manufacturing goals.
So I would just say, I mean, yes, Ben is certainly correct in highlighting and mentioning, certainly some of the other incentives in the credits that exist in the Inflation Reduction Act to help produce more and manufacture more here in this country. But I think what he neglects, and what this law definitely neglects to take into account, is that all takes time. None of this happens overnight. None of this happens within a year. It takes years to produce these facilities, to get them up and running, to mine and process these minerals and the battery components that we need. Years is what it takes. And this law does not take that into account at all. And, and again, the fact that once it was signed into law, we went from 60 eligible model vehicles that were eligible for a credit down to 18 immediately that were eligible to receive this credit. And once Treasury issues its guidance, I don't know what the landscape is going to look like for what vehicles are eligible to receive this credit. So while the government was trying to do something helpful to incentivize consumers to purchase these vehicles by helping to reduce the cost, they may have actually made it so difficult that none of these vehicles are going to be able to receive any type of credit at all for some time. And that's, I think, what is the most significant problem with this. Again, is we were on an upswing with consumer adoption, and a lot more models are coming out, and billions of investments are being made in this country. All of that stuff was happening. And it feels like this law is really going to just pull a stop and force all of us to slow down dramatically before we have time to ramp up. I will mention, I don't know what the solution, what the answer is. I'm not sure, as the law is drafted right now, that there's a lot of room to make these fixes. As I mentioned, final assembly is the one that we're all dealing with. It's the immediate impact right now. Senator Warnock has introduced legislation, and I believe there's going to be one introduced in the House similar, where he takes it in consideration, and he is asking for more time. He just wants a little bit more time for us to build up the supply chains and the production here in the U.S., in North America, to make this all applicable.
We're actually almost to the bewitching hour. David, any final words, and then I'll give us a close and see if John has anything he wants to say as well.
I think I need to say, look, it's really interesting to hear the US debate, and I think that the broader other countries didn't get a look in, and to be honest, the same has happened in the EU. So it's a plea for all of those involved in this that if we're going to have this trade and climate change debate, it has to be at the very least with allies, preferably the WTO. But let's allies to start with, and I think we've all been guilty of kind of charging ahead without doing that, and we need to rein it back in a little.
And David, you're mentioning the EU. I was just in a discussion the other day with some German politicians, and there's so many different conflicting streams of policy coming at them, between the war in Ukraine, the severing of the pipelines, literally, from Russia. There's now apparently the Greens, or part of the government, are actually going to, I'm told, maybe support fracking in Germany now, but they still won't support new nuclear, but they will allow the old nuclear to stay online. I mean, the contradictions in policy are enormous, that we see just all over the world as far as these competing objectives, in this case, industrial policy and environmental policy. And as one of the questions pointed out, and Ben said, you know, there's a desperate time, a crunch to try to get a carbon reduction over the next few years to meet climate goals. You know, there's a lot of competing forces here, and a lot of things to continue this discussion, which we will be doing at WITA, talking about green industrial policies in a couple of weeks. John, any final words before we close the session?
Just one, you know, which is that industrial policy is not one single thing. And there, you know, the 45X credit is a very powerful tool in industrial policy, no doubt about that. Consumption subsidies with a sort of a nationality-based restriction built into them, that's also industrial policy. But you know, it's not a question of should we use or not use industrial policy in support of you know, having a strong manufacturing base for electric vehicles. There's also a question of what kind. And you know, I think the Rufus's question is a compelling one. You know, what are we going to lose if we abandon our historic stance against nationality-based restrictions, tax measures? I think that's a you know, an important theme that goes way beyond this debate over vehicles.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Apologies to our audience for running a little bit long. John actually was one of the people who contacted me more than a month ago, talking about the EV tax credits, and helped inspire us pulling this event together. Really grateful to you, Jennifer. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. I think, Ben, I was reminded that you had participated in some WITA events way back when, in some previous guises in our in-person events. Glad to have you online. And David, a pleasure to be connected with you. Thanks for joining us. Are you coming to us from London, I think?
Yep, I'm in London today.
Great, thanks. Well, we love having our global audience and our global participants. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your perspective as well. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future WITA events.